We are in this series called Fixer Uppers. We've been talking about how in every relationship there's somebody that needs a little fixing up. I like what Matt said earlier today, that God is such a gentle fixer. That's something that is good to know when we're thinking about fixer-uppers, is that he doesn't just come in and just blow everything up. That's how I clean my house. I just kind of blow everything up. You know? God doesn't do it that way. He's gentle, and I really appreciated that word that Matt said. And the whole idea of this series is that in every relationship there's a fixer-upper, and it happens to be me. It happens to be us. It's like we're the fixer-upper. So let's work on this whole idea of fixing up our relationships, and I hope that this series has been helpful. Well, today I'm going to be talking about boundaries in relationships. And my Siri is on for some reason. I don't know why. Stop, Siri. Okay. There we are. Okay. She really wanted to get something out of the message today. She's very much into this. She's like, man, I need boundaries. Okay. A couple assumptions. First one is we all have and need boundaries in our lives that will help us live healthy lives. Level set it. We all have those, right? And number two, we all need to work on our boundaries. Because boundaries aren't something that are just like set it and forget it. Boundaries are something that are continually having to be managed and changed and developed and strengthened. And sometimes we need to construct boundaries. Sometimes boundaries need to be moved in our lives. Sometimes they have to come down. And today, I'm going to challenge you to work on your boundaries. So I want you to be thinking about that during the message today. We're going to be talking about the life of Moses. And Moses is a really great example for working on boundaries because he had to work through it a lot. So we're going to try to pull some practical concepts out of Moses' life and look at how we can work on boundaries. Now, in a very physical and real sense, not like relational boundaries, just like physical boundaries, Moses was all over the place. He was born as a Jewish Hebrew boy in a land that was, he was born in Egypt, but he was as a Jewish person, and so he was born in like this really a hard time where Egypt was basically the slave drivers of his people. And so he's born inside of another nation, but from another. And throughout his life, he journeys into the wilderness. He goes out into the wilderness, and he encounters God, and then he goes back to Egypt, and he confronts Pharaoh and wants to have the Israelites be set free, and then he goes back out into the wilderness with all of the Israelites, and then he's confronted with this gigantic boundary called the Red Sea, and then God removes that boundary, and then he spends all this time in the wilderness, and he's scouting the promised land. He's never able to go in it, but he's able to see it, and he's surviving in a world with no physical boundaries, and so really everything in Moses' life becomes about relationships. How does he create boundaries in his life around relationships? And so he has relationships with the Egyptians. Those are his oppressors. He has relationships with his people, the Israelites. He has his family, he has his extended family. He has to deal with Pharaoh and many other people. Moses ends up having to deal with a lot of things in relationships. Now, boundaries, they are meant to keep us grounded. So I don't want you to think of boundaries as good or bad because they think of them as like they're helpful in living a healthy lifestyle. Now, when they get violated, that's when things can kind of get crazy because whenever boundaries are violated, there's always severe consequences, right? You don't have to think very hard about some boundaries that are being violated even today, right? We have Russia and Ukraine, and those boundaries get violated, and man, the whole world is up in arms, right? And so it's a really big deal. So Moses, he's having to deal with all of these boundary issues, and he's living in this world that's really not like his own. Now, if you were Moses, you might look in his life, and he might look even in your life, and be able to see some similarities. Like, how many of you would say that, like Moses, the world around us is getting crazier?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How many would agree, like with Moses, when he looked around, he'd be able to say, man, the schools and the policies that people are making and the things that they're teaching, they are contrary to my beliefs, and that causes some conflict in me. And he looks around and he sees politicians and leaders and he says, man, I think the politicians and leaders are creating more problems, not less, in my life. Right? We'd look at that and maybe say the same exact thing. And I think that if Moses had social media, he would probably say, man, my social media confirms everything I'm believing. This world is going crazy, right? So here's the thing. We have to expect that our relational boundaries are going to be challenged, just like Moses. We live in this world where our boundaries are going to be challenged, and it's best for us to understand and embrace that so we can begin to be really good at adjusting and adapting those boundaries. So let's talk about Moses. See, the story begins in him living in a world that doesn't hold his values for faith, family, or morality. And I'm going to start in Exodus chapter 1, the second part of verse 2. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Why were they doing that? Well, they felt threatened by their numbers. They felt threatened that there were so many Israelites and so few of them because they were just growing in population. And so their big idea was to thin out the population of them by working them harder. And so they began to work at them ruthlessly, and they made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew woman during childbirth on a delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. Now, this is an evil and despicable thing for somebody to do. But this shows the desperation at which Pharaoh was at in wanting to control the population. He was feeling very threatened by the Israelites. And so he starts violating some really big boundaries. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? And I love how quick and clever their response is. The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. That was fast, right? They were quick. So then Pharaoh gave this order to all the people, not just the midwives. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Moses was born at this time. He was born in a hostile environment. And he ends up living in this hostile environment in a very unusual way, because Moses wasn't raised in a home that was a Hebrew home. He wasn't raised by an Israelite family. He was actually going to be raised in an Egyptian home by Pharaoh's daughter, and his grandfather was going to be Pharaoh. And so he lives in this world, and I think that we can relate more to Moses than we can to the rest of the Israelites, because we are in this world around us, and it is all around us. We can't go anywhere without. We don't have the way that it was at that time. Like the Israelites lived in one area, and the Egyptians lived in another area. And as long as you were in your area, everything kind of worked by your value system, and when you were in the other area, it worked by the other value system. That wasn't the way it was for Moses. He was raised in an Egyptian home. And so he's being confronted with this all the time. So we're going to continue the story. Exodus chapter 2. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds in the bank of the Nile. She's hiding Moses to protect him from being killed. His sister's name is Miriam, stood at the distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? This is Miriam saying, hey, how about I help fix the situation? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. Now, this has nothing to do with my message. I just love how God turned this story around. Moses' mother ends up getting paid to nurse him. When he was being hunted and he was going to be killed, and the very people that were meant to kill him actually were the people that were paying his mother to be able to nurse him. And this just goes to show, when the Bible says that God works out all things for the good who believe him, he really does. He works in the background. It's such an awesome part of that story. So the woman took the baby and nursed him, and when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So Moses, being rescued by the people that were trying to kill him, is an amazing part of the story. But God put him right in the middle of people who were not living for God. This is where Moses' story begins to form. And Moses, he spends 40 years being in Pharaoh's household. It wasn't like he was just there for a few years. No, he lived there right through his adult life. And came a point in his life where he went out into the city to see how the Israelites were being treated. And, maybe he was just curious and he heard about it and he wanted to see it with his own eyes, or maybe he knew about it and he wanted to be able to see it and maybe even to do something about it. And that's what he did. He saw a Hebrew man being whipped and beaten by an Egyptian man, and he reacted in anger and he killed the Egyptian man. Now, he thought that he did it in secret, and he buried the body and went about his business. And it wasn't too much longer when he was out in the city again, and he tried to break up a fight between two Hebrew men. And their reaction was, what, are you going to kill us too? And Moses realized the jig was up, his secret was out, and he now was going to be convicted of murder and probably killed by Pharaoh. And so he did the only thing that he knew how to do, which was he flees. He runs into the desert, and he's 40 years old, and this is where we really start to pick up on the story of Moses. Everything else has just been about the context of his life. And now, at 40 years old, he is starting. Now, I like this about Moses because two things. I like that this story starts as an adult, because somehow we think we have to be raised in this into our calling from a really young age. And if we don't know what we're going to do at the age of 18 or 20 or 25 or whatever that year is, that we think that we're somehow missing it. But here's Moses at 40 years old, and I like that his story and his journey really starts after he murders somebody, because Moses proves you're not disqualified by your past.
Yeah.
Right? You're not disqualified by the things you do, because we're simply qualified by saying yes to God and being obedient.
Yeah.
That's what qualifies us,
Yeah.
not our past.
Amen.
And so he goes out into the wilderness, he becomes a nomad. He's a loner. He spends the time in the wilderness as a fugitive. And he's out there for a few years. We call it another 40 years. Think about that. Another 40 years he's out in the wilderness. He's 80 years old. Now, if you would look at Moses' life, and you would see the journey that he was on of almost being killed, raised in an Egyptian household, 40 years, murder something, leaving, heading out into the wilderness, and in those 40 years that he's out in the wilderness, he finds a family. He finds a wife. He has children. If you would look at his life, you'd be like, that was a happy ending for that man, right? But this is where God is really starting to begin to call him, because God calls Moses. And this first boundary that Moses is going to learn from God is about spending time with God. The boundary that we put around our lives and the time that we spend with God is something that Moses learned at the beginning of his ministry with freeing the Israelites. I love it because it's really the same thing that Jesus did when he began his ministry. He got alone with God, right? He went out into the wilderness. So Moses is living a pretty good life at 80 years old. He's tending a flock. And he's out there and he sees this bush and it's burning. Now, I lived in the desert for a while. I know a couple things about things burning in the desert. It's very dangerous. Things burn very, very fast. And they also spread very fast, right? But he sees this bush and it's not being consumed. It's just continuing burning. And so he begins to investigate it. He gets closer and he hears God's voice. He says, Moses, stop, take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And this boundary that God has established with him in that moment is the value of being in the presence of God. The holiness, the impartation that God gives when we're in his presence. This is what Moses is learning. Now for us, we need to know that we need to not neglect the boundary of having set apart time with God. And what Moses ended up doing is he put a really big boundary around his relationship with God, because Moses was known more than anyone else during his time of having this access and this relationship with God. And what I like about Moses is that from this point on, he was no longer a loner, but he was alone with God.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a really good way for us to think about our time with God. We don't want to be a loner. We don't want to close ourselves off from all of our relationships, but it is important for us to be alone with God, because that's where we find the strength and wisdom to lead as he's calling us to lead. So, including the meeting at the burning bush, the Bible records at least 8 times where Moses set himself apart with God. King David and Jesus, others model this importance of establishing this very important boundary. Now, I want to come back later in the message. I want to talk about this boundary a little bit more because it is so important, so pivotal to all the other boundaries that we're going to talk about today. But I want us to prioritize in our minds how this boundary kind of like allows every other boundary to flow out of it. This is where we start, this boundary. So Moses meets him at the bush. Let's see what God tells him. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Moses had to be thinking at this moment, wow, this is really, really good news. This is amazing news. God is going to do something awesome. Every time I watch the Burning Bush channel, it's always bad news. Finally, something on this channel actually has some good news. I'm very excited about this, right? So he's got to be excited. And then God says, he continues, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses has a strong reaction at this point. He's probably thinking, I'm 80 years old. This is important because it's important for us to know that we're not limited by our stage of life, whether we think we're too young or too old, whether we think that we don't have all the things that we need in our status. When God calls us, he promises and he promotes and he provides. And this is what we can count on God for. So Moses was called, and God's plan for Moses extended his capabilities, his social network. He didn't have any connections to Egypt anymore. He had no status anymore. But God had this plan, and his first reaction was, wow, God, I'm so honored. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. I've been looking for a long time to be able to go back to Egypt and do something about this. No, he didn't say that at all. He basically said, actually, you have the wrong person. Right? I can imagine maybe he was even looking around that bush to see if maybe God was speaking to anybody else, because he couldn't even imagine himself doing that. So Moses went, and he ends up following God's mission, and he confronts Pharaoh, and he brings all the plagues and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into all of that, but it's an amazing part of Moses' story. But what I wanted to focus on is some of these boundaries that are being created in his life, not on the amazing story that he had in Egypt. So the boundary, Moses' next boundary was one of including the people closest to him inside of his boundary that he has of his life and his calling. And that is the boundary of Moses' family. Now, I never really thought about this before, even though I'm very familiar with this story. I think before I was studying this idea of boundaries, if you would have asked me, so what did Moses do with his family anyway when he went to Egypt? I thought, well, he probably left them with his father-in-law, right? It's a pretty dangerous mission. It's probably very important. But no, Moses ends up bringing them with him along on this mission that he has. Because it says here in Exodus 4, then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive. Jethro said, go, and I wish you well. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons and put them on a donkey and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. Now you might think, well, probably his kids were older or whatever. It would be a miracle because he put them all on one donkey. They were probably young, right? They were probably just a young family. And so he's got these kids in tow to Egypt on this incredibly dangerous mission to go confront Pharaoh about releasing over 1 million people from his kingdom. And the family is going along. And I think for us, I want to say, as you follow God, include your family. Because this is what Moses did. He didn't leave them behind because the work was too important. He didn't leave them behind to protect them from something. He said, no, let's go and do this together. Bring your family with you. But also, be careful not to seclude your family. Go on the mission together, but don't pull away from all the other community that God has. And I'm saying this because there's a boundary trend that I'm noticing more of like in the past 10, 15, 20 years, is that when small families start, they build up all these brand new walls around their time and how they're gonna be involved in church and ministry and the things that they're gonna do. And one thing that Moses didn't do is say, well, Lord, let me wait until my family's older, then I'll go and do this. Moses said, no, I'm going to bring my family, I'm just going to do what God is saying to do. And I think when God comes to you and he calls you into a family like this, and and of course he wants you to be involved in the mission of the church and everything you do, you're here with your family in your life, your stage of life, no matter how old or young you are, no matter how old or young your family is, the time that we're supposed to engage in what God is doing is right now. Moses didn't wait for another time, right? He said, okay, let's take this and let's do this with my family. Now, before moving on this point right here, I want to talk about Moses' reaction to God's call to look at this next boundary, okay? This boundary is all about escaping in walls. These are boundaries that we create, okay? We construct boundaries sometimes. We're in an unhealthy mindset. We're trying to protect things that we feel are threatened. And these boundaries can push us sometimes out of God's will, and I want to look at a couple of them, okay? The first kind, and Moses was actually doing this when he was having this conversation with God, is we put excuses around our time or our involvement or our reaction, and they kind of start pulling us away from what God is calling us to, because we start diverting ourselves around excuses. They're like little barriers that we put up that kind of allow us to divert around what we feel God is calling to. One of the most famous people to do this out of the Bible is Jonah. God called him to go to Nineveh. He threw a couple excuses at God. He felt like those were pretty good, and he got on a boat and he went in the opposite direction. Right? His excuses ended up diverting him from the call of God. And so Moses starts to throw out some of these excuses as well, and God immediately begins to have this conversation with him. The first excuse that Moses throws out is he says, who am I? Right? Who am I? Moses is questioning his identity. God's response is, doesn't matter who you are because I am going to be with you. And his second excuse was, well, what if people question my authority? Right? Now he's thinking about his status. And God says, it's okay. You're going to go with my power, my authority. And then he says, well, what if people don't believe me? Now Moses is questioning his credibility. And then he's like, well, I'm not good with words. I'm not good with people. And, he's talking about his lack of people skills and this just lack of what he feels and skills that he lacks altogether. And God says, it's okay. We kind of went back and forth on a little bit. He's like, fine, I'll let you go. I'll let you bring your brother Aaron with you. He's better than, he's a better thesaurus than you are, whatever it was that he needed. And so he brings Aaron with him, and they go on this call. Now, what I like about this is if you go in and you read the story, Aaron pretty much doesn't say much at all. In all the encounters, it's always Moses saying stuff, right? But God let him bring him anyway. He's like, yeah, go ahead and bring him, but I'm still going to work through you. I'm going to speak through you, and then you can have Aaron. And then once they get there, Moses realized God was right all along. The point here is that our excuses can construct boundaries around our life that keep us in the same space for years or in a lane we were never meant to be in, because we construct them and we define them. And a lot of times they're pushing us away from God's calling. So be careful with our excuses when we feel like God is calling us, because he's calling us for a reason, and he wants to confront those identity and those skill and those status things that we might think that we have, because it's really in him that we're going. That's what Moses was learning from God. Now, the second kind of wall is this wall of like seclusion, okay? Now, this is a boundary that God was calling Moses out of. It was this seclusion boundary. Moses was spent many, many years in the wilderness, right? So many years in the wilderness. And God was calling him out of this boundary of seclusion. And what Moses was hearing from God is he said, Moses, you can't do my mission and be separated from the people you're meant to save. Yeah. This is really important. This is very applicable to us. Because in this world that we live in, where people aren't living according to our values or doing life the way that we want, or they're teaching our kids things that we wouldn't teach our kids, those are the very people that we're meant to save. And we can't build walls and seclude ourselves from the people that we're about to save. This is what Moses was learning. So going it alone is so far from God's best for us, and to accomplish the mission that God has for us, which is to share Jesus' love, God is calling us out of seclusion. One of the biggest factors of seclusion right now is the kind of like the after effects of the COVID pandemic, right? And we really got secluded off in a lot of ways. And the church did too. And the seclusion and all the controversy and all the things, we all know what all the controversy is. I think that the message of the church got lost in the debates and the arguments of the day. And it's time to rise up. Because we have a voice. And our voice isn't a debate and it isn't an argument. Our voice is hope. Yeah. Right? This is what Moses wasn't coming to the Israelites and going to set up a new government inside of Egypt and somehow make things better. No, he was calling them out. He was bringing hope. And this is what I believe is the call of our day as the church, is that we are carriers, we are bringers of the message of hope into the world that we have. We don't have to win any debate on anything that people are arguing about, because we have the answer to all of the strife and all the concerns and all of the worry, and that is we bring the hope of Christ. And so my challenge to our campus here, as we move boundaries, as we think about what's next around the corner and our voice into our community, is that we would see that we have a voice of hope to bring. Now, also want to talk about this after effect of COVID, is that even in our own homes and the way that we interact with the community around us and people around us, we become more secluded. And we have a huge danger of stepping into a new normal that is more devoid of relationship than ever before. And my challenge to all of us is to remember that in order to bring hope, we have to be with people who need it. Right? And in order to bring hope, the family of God needs to have this regular rhythm of coming together into worship and then breaking off into groups for edification, whether that be small groups or classes, or the things that make the family of God is the community of God. And so this whole boundary of like these walls of seclusion, like it's like it hasn't been 40 years, but man, it's felt like a long time that we've been in this like wilderness of this, and I think that God is calling us out, and that's my encouragement to all of us. Now, moving out of seclusion requires us to hone our ability to communicate and work with other people. This is my shameless plug for the Communications Masterclass. These people that we're around, that we need to build these boundaries around, and for are sometimes really, really toxic people. Sometimes we have to put boundaries up that protect us from really bad situations. But more often than not, we're supposed to be part of their story of redemption. And one of the greatest examples that I've ever seen of this is with my wife, Sharon. She was, we were engaged to be married, and her father with her sister and her mother, had a absolutely horrible relationship, because her father said and did things that you could not even imagine that another human being would do. And he did those things to his family. And there was a gigantic rift between them. And I remember when, at the time we were engaged, Sharon came to me and she said, "I think that God wants me to forgive my dad." That was huge. Because he didn't deserve that forgiveness, right? Not from her point of view at that time. And so I sat by her, she called her dad on the phone, and she said, "Dad, I want you to know, for this thing, I forgive you." Now, her dad was used to being beat up by everyone because of all the things that he'd done. And it wasn't like he heard those words that "I forgive you," and all of a sudden everything changed. It was actually a very short conversation, and it didn't seem like anything really came out of it. But what ended up happening in that conversation is, from that moment, everything began to change. everything began to change, because from that moment and into the future years of her life with her dad, he was there to be able to walk her down the aisle for her wedding. He was able to know his grandkids. Her sister was able to have a relationship with her father. Her sister's kids were able to have a relationship with their grandfather. And then Sharon's great-grandfather ended up coming to the Lord, and so did her dad become the Lord. Like, the power of removing these boundaries and realizing that we're supposed to be part of people's story of redemption is so incredibly powerful. So I want to talk about the first boundary to take down. The first one to take down is the one that is holding you back from following God's call in your life. Let God call you into your next season of obedience and to follow him. Say yes to Jesus. If you've never said yes to Jesus and you've been kind of holding on to this mindset that you're not even sure if you need Jesus, take that boundary down. And if you feel like God's been calling you to do something with your life, and you feel like it's never the right time, I invite you to say yes and to take that boundary down. This might be spending more time with people that don't know God, that live around you, that you know that you're supposed to be called to reach and talk to and to build a relationship to. And you know there's a pandemic going on and you're very busy and they're probably really busy and you don't really see them. And whatever that might be, I invite you to take that boundary down so that you can say yes to God. Don't throw the identity questions at him. Don't throw the status or the skill thing. Just say yes and see what God will do, and do it with all of your heart. And the first boundary to set up is the one that gets us into God's presence. The one that I was talking about at the very beginning. What does it look like for you to mature in this boundary around your life? And if you're not really sure, I have a really easy exercise for you to consider doing this week. And that is, get out a pen and a piece of paper and write it down and describe it. And if you find yourself really struggling to describe what this boundary looks like in your life, then this means there's something for you to create. Maybe there's a blind spot and you can ask someone else for help and how to build a boundary around your time with the Lord. Or maybe it's just as simple as you saying, you know what, this is what I feel God is saying to me, this is what I'm going to do, and you start working on that. And maybe it isn't that hard for you to describe what that boundary is. Write it down and describe it, and then share it with somebody else and talk to them about that, and let them challenge, see what there might be the other blind spots for you to work on. But this one is so important because in order for us to be able to do the one where we're going out and we're doing the things that God called us to do, it would be empty if we don't actually experience that, the presence and the love from God first. Because we're supposed to be hearers and doers. And if we're just doers, then we might as well just have a club where we do stuff, right? But we're supposed to be hearers and doers. So this morning, I want to ask you to just take a few moments with me and allow God to speak to us. Allow him to talk to us about the boundaries in our lives. You know, Moses, he had a few relationships that were so important. He had Jethro, who was able to give him advice. He had Aaron, who was supposed to go and do things with him. So we don't have to do it alone. And he had Miriam, even from his very youngest age, looking out for him. These are so important relationships for us to invest in and to have, in turn, investing into us. And so this morning, I just want to take a moment, clear your mind, open your heart to the Lord, ask him to just have a conversation with you right now. Because he's telling us this is holy ground. I'm speaking to you. I want you to hear my voice. These boundaries that you have around your life, the ones that have brought you into seclusion, pulled you away. We're supposed to draw a boundary around the people that we're including into our circle, not a boundary that pulls us away. In this alone time that we have with the Lord, that we'd cherish it and protect it. We'd hold it at the highest value. So Lord, we thank you that you're speaking to us, that we can be here, holy ground, hearing your voice. We ask that you would give us a renewed sense of importance around the boundaries of our lives, that we wouldn't become complacent with the boundaries we've always had, but we would look at them, we would investigate them, we would say, is this the right boundary for this season? Do I need to move this? Do I need to think about some relationships that I'm supposed to be a part of, that I've been building boundaries around? Maybe that's somebody in our family. Maybe there's been some hurt. Maybe it's a trusted friend that's just kind of gone and done their own thing and you don't know how to reach them anymore. Maybe it's just as simple as someone we just know, that we're called to be part of their story of redemption because we're carrying a voice of hope. Lord, we ask that you would just speak to us now, in this moment. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Just going to keep the guitar here playing for a little bit, keep this space open here. If you just want to get alone with God, come up front and pray. We can pray with you, that's great. I just want to let you know that God wants you to keep working on your boundaries and keep thinking about the ways that God is calling you, and keep drawing bigger circles around people that we may have been tempted to seclude. So I just want to thank you for coming out today. You should have a great Sunday. We're going to take like a 15 minutes. We're going to come back here for a little Q&A with Pastor Nathan and I. We'll talk about the old campus switch around, okay? All right. God bless you guys.